Hello and a happy new year to you all. In this episode, we're going to be looking at Japanese submarine operations in the Pacific in the early part of the war. While I'm sure we're all familiar with the Imperial Japanese surface fleet actions during 1941-42, especially if you've listened to my discussions with Jeff Cox in episode 14 and 63, but there seems to be very little mention of submarines. Which is interesting because if we look at the Battle of the North Atlantic, it was all about the German U-boat. So joining me today is Mark Stille. Mark is a retired US Navy commander, alumni of the US Naval War College, and author of numerous Osprey titles, mainly focusing on the war in the Pacific. His latest being US Navy Fleet Destroyer versus Imperial Japanese Navy Fleet Submarine. Now, this podcast is brought to you by listeners like yourself who enjoy the show and help me find the time to put it together by becoming patrons. By committing to pay $1 or $2 each month via Patreon, or even pushing the boat out and committing to the Rockefeller level of support like listener Laura Stille. Thank you, Laura, for your support. You can find out more at patreon.com/WW2podcast. If Patreon is not your thing for whatever reason and you would like to join the gang, go to ww2podcast.com/support and you'll find information on how to support the show via PayPal. In doing so, if you check the box to be added to the mailing list, I will send you links to extras when I have them. So that's www2podcast.com/support. So Mark, thanks for joining me. When we think of the naval war in the Pacific, it's usually all about carriers and naval aviation. We hear little of the Japanese submarine campaign. So I wondered if we go all the way back to sort of brass tacks to look at the Imperial Japanese Navy post-World War One. Did they have any submarine capabilities? Well,
of course they did, because they got a handful of captured German subs, and that was state-of-the-art technology. So they did have some submarines before the war, but they got a big jump start after the war when these subs fell into their hands. The Japanese have this very, clever, but perhaps overly clever system of building submarines for various missions. So they have a whole array of submarines for specialized missions, which is all built to support this doctrine, which is to attack U.S. Navy fleet units, right? Which they applied with some degree of success during the war. But overall, it was a big bust, because it turns out it's hard for a submarine to chase down fleet units, right? Still is, always will be.
Are their submarines radically different from anyone else? They're not working in a vacuum. They've got some post-World War One German submarines. I mean, are their submarines radically different from anybody else's?
No, but they were a lot bigger for the most part. They were much bigger than U.S. submarines and a lot bigger than European submarines, because they had to be to operate in the vast seas of the Pacific Ocean, right? So they are different.
It had never occurred to me that they would have to be larger. For that reason, I just assumed they'd have some sort of auxiliary ships that they'd mate up with to refuel and everything else, so they'd be the same size. But of course, the Pacific is somewhat enormous to try and coordinate those kind of resupply sort of logistical missions.
And it's hard to do that in enemy-held areas. So they had to have a great cruising radius to do their mission. They were all designed with this mission and purpose, and that was long-range strikes against the approaching American fleet in preparation for the big decisive battle somewhere in the Western Pacific.
Yeah, this is a sort of strange obsession. I say strange obsession about the decisive battle. So when they're building them,
a total obsession. Yeah.
When they're building them, are they building them to sort of work as I would say lone wolves. Sounds too German. I want to say lone ninjas, I suppose, for the Japanese. Are they in mind to be built to work in packs, or built as sort of individual units that go out on their own?
Kind of both. They were built to operate in groups, and they were controlled by a central command authority, which was also at sea in a submarine as they worked towards developing the strategy that they were going to employ, but they weren't employed in packs per se, like the Germans were and the Americans were later in the war, not that closely together. They were sent out in groups, but they all had assigned patrol areas, and they were moved about by this command authority to change their patrol areas in response to the advancing U.S. forces. But they weren't in packs per se. They were never able to do that.
As I'm led to believe, like I might have this wrong, but the Germans would send their U-boats would string out in a line, and one would find them, and then the others would radio through, and then that would organise the group of submarines. So they weren't quite working on the same. They weren't feeding off that sort of German experience in the Atlantic.
They had no knowledge of the German plans to do that before the war when they were developing their own tactics, but it was kind of like that. The Japanese also had scouting lines, as the Germans did, and when one unit gained contact on the American task force, then they would all flock to that target area. Well, not all, but most of the scouting line would flock to that area. The Germans, when they got together, they operated tactically, and they tried to coordinate operations, but the Japanese never were able to do that. The Japanese concept was more based on, here's where I think the Americans will be along this path of movement, and I will station submarines along that path as best I can to get a shot at them as they come by. That didn't work out usually too well. But you don't know where they're going, and they're moving fast. And once in a while it did work. They would blow by, and Japanese would get a shot at a key unit. But off Guadalcanal, the Americans would, to their own detriment, they would operate in the same area for week after week. Well, the Japanese kind of caught on to that, so they would station their subs in this operating area, and there was a lot more opportunity for shots. And that's when they got several shots at units, to include sinking a carrier. Other than that, really, that the whole concept was rather spotty and more of a bust than anything else.
What it struck me as well was the very outbreak of war with Pearl Harbor. I mean, you don't hear of them there. Are they kind of written out of that sort of strategy to be included in any sort of action with the surface ships?
That's a great thing to bring up, because here you have a case study of the Japanese submarine force in action. So they had been trained and they had been equipped to do this mission, the exact mission that they were ordered to do off Pearl Harbor. So they sent every modern sub they had in the Imperial fleet to support the Pearl Harbor attack. There were 30-odd submarines in direct support of the strike force or stationed around Oahu. And because the carriers were unproven, a lot of the Japanese admirals thought, well, our backup plan here is the submarines, because, of course, they'll be successful. There's so many of these in a small area. There's no way we won't pick off ships coming and going out of Pearl Harbor. So much was expected out of all these subs there off Pearl Harbor. And as it turns out, they were totally ineffective. So their doctrine was a bust. And they had, surprisingly, they really didn't give it much rigorous testing before the war. But when they did, it was a bust. And that was combined with their very cautious tactical employment of submarines, where they would stay submerged and actually fire torpedoes while submerged. So the whole thing was a big bust, and they knew it before the war. And their first big operation off Hawaii was shown to be a bust.
Yeah, why did the Japanese submarine attack on Pearl Harbor fail so badly, with so many new submarines there? Is it all just doctrine? Was there an element of bad luck?
It's all just doctrine. I mean, you figure that there's untold scores of ships, both military and civilian, coming and going from Oahu, from Pearl Harbor, right, or Honolulu, and the Japanese rarely saw any. And I think they sank, like, during the span of 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, they sank like 3 ships, 3 merchant ships. They never even got a shot off, really, at a naval target. So it was due to doctrine. Their doctrine was very, very conservative. And they would stay submerged during the day because they were afraid of detection. Because the few pre-war drills they did and tests they did do on this doctrine, they found out that their subs were very vulnerable. So they were ordered then to not show themselves. So they would stay submerged all day. So it's kind of hard to find anything if you're submerged, right? That's why they didn't say anything.
And presumably at periscope depth, you can be seen from above because you're probably not that deep at that point.
Well, I guess that's true in the Mediterranean, for example, but it's not true in the Pacific, unless you're really at near the surface. But no, that's not true. That's not a problem there. But even showing their periscope, they thought was being too risky. So they were truly submerged, and they would rely on sound detection, which is fine if things come right across you. That might work. Otherwise, it didn't work. So that's why they didn't say anything. That's why they didn't attack anything.
Did they have any other aids? I mean, how developed were they in electronic detection of sonar, radar, that kind of thing?
They did not carry radar at all. They only got radar in 1944 on their submarines. That was a handicap for most of the war. It was a grievous handicap. Their sonar systems were okay. I mean, as good as other navies were. Again, a good sonar system is fairly short range, and that was the problem that the Americans had on their destroyers. They had a decent sonar, but it's just very short ranged. And of course, if you're at speed if your ship's moving through the water, then your detection range is even less. So it's very short range, and that's why the Americans, during the first year of the war, and trying to defend from Japanese submarine attacks, they never were able to detect or attack a Japanese submarine about to attack a high-value target.
If we flip the table then and look at the Americans, I mean, had they expected a large Japanese sort of submarine threat pre-war, and had they planned for it, trained for it?
They did see a sub threat, but they were aware of the size of the Japanese sub force, and there were 60 to 70 units in the Japanese sub force altogether. A lot of those were not modern and could not get as far as Hawaii. So that left 30-odd modern units that were a threat, but the Americans were aware of that. So I think that there's a lot of mirror imaging going on there, that the Americans expected the Japanese to employ their subs the same way that the Americans were. And strangely enough, the Americans had almost the exact same submarine employment tactic. They thought subs were very vulnerable, and they were going to use them the same way. They were going to do submerged attacks. Most of the American submarines were deployed to the Asiatic fleet. There were like 32 subs out there in the Philippines, and they went down to the Dutch East Indies later on. And guess what? They also were almost totally ineffective in attacking Japanese targets in the Dutch East Indies. There were plenty of targets, but they didn't see them, and they didn't attack them. So exact same problem.
The Japanese submarines wouldn't be affected by the pre-war naval treaties because I think the submarines were exempt, but presumably the American destroyers, which were the kind of workhorses of the anti-submarine effort, would have been have problems with the naval treaties. Did that cause a problem with basically their capacity to wage war against the submarines, some of these pre-war naval treaty ships?
There's a problem there because the destroyer tonnage was restricted in the London Treaty, and so was submarine tonnage. And of course, the Japanese had a lower tonnage allocation than the American and Royal Navy. So it wasn't so much a problem with submarines because they're so small tonnage-wise that you could build plenty for your needs. But for destroyers, that wasn't the case. So the Americans didn't go for the big destroyers like the Germans were doing, and the French had done to a larger degree. So both the Americans and the British, went for about a 1,500-ton ship, which is fine. And U.S. ships were bigger than British destroyers because the Brits were operating close in, the Mediterranean, close into the bases. They didn't need them that large, right? The Americans did, though, because they were going to operate with these task forces in the far-flung Pacific. So they settled on this design about 1,500 tons. It was a nice design, but they were designed to be primarily torpedo boats. So they had a very heavy torpedo battery. And secondary, they were designed to be part of the air defense protection for the task forces. So they had a very large 5-inch battery and a very extensive fire control system on board. And so ASW was not really a design priority. So there was just basic stuff, depth charge racks and a basic sonar. And that's, really all there was for ASW. And to make it worse, in designing their training programs, they emphasized torpedo attack and anti-aircraft warfare and not ASW.
Yeah, and you're kind of hampered, I guess, if the submarine's not going to come to the surface, you're not going to hit it with a torpedo.
I mean, they knew there's a threat there, but they didn't see it as a overarching threat, as a major threat. So did not train for it.
It's funny, isn't it? Because I came out, I get the feeling, being in Britain, that the U-boat really comes out of World War One as a big sort of bogeyman when it came to the naval warfare, and the Germans are barred from using it. There's sort of an acceptance that it could be a real difficult weapon to try and defeat, which I'm not quite getting this from the American and the Japanese, that they've got that a killer weapon, and it's more like they don't really know how to use it, and it's not necessarily the problem that it should have been.
Well, it was a big problem, of course, as they adapted their tactics. Well, at least the Americans did. But just like the British, having invented ASDIC, sonar, they thought that really made the submarine, it lost its invisibility. So it wouldn't be that hard to deal with. And the Americans bought into that notion as well. A very simplistic and wishful view, but that's how they were thinking.
You mentioned depth charges, which I presume, they're the classic thing you see on the movies, and they're bouncing off the back of ships in all the movies, and the big sort of plume of water goes up. Is that their main anti-submarine armament of the US Navy? And how effective are they?
That's all they had. Now, of course, you could get a depth charge in the water by rolling it off the back of the ship, or they have these things called Y guns. And it's simply a depth charge launcher on the side of the ship, so we can propel there are various ranges based on the amount of powder in this gun. So that would launch it about 150 yards max away from the ship. So that's one more way to get more depth charges in the water. But without a good sonar telling you where the target is and how deep it is, you're just guessing. And plus, because they weren't maximized for ASW, there wasn't a big depth charge load on these destroyers. So later in the war, especially in the Atlantic, you would load up, 60 or 90 depth charges. But at this period of the war, they might carry 12 or 24. And you're guessing, right? So you're trying to blanket this area where the submarine was detected, but 12 depth charges, won't do it. They were, at this point in the war, like I said, they were ineffective. And there's a chart in the book about all the losses the Japanese suffered in the first year of the war, and 0 of those were due to a submarine attacking an American task force. There were no losses. So that tells you how effective they were.
Well, what surprised me is, considering how much you always see them going off in the films and things, that they had to be within 10 yards to do any great damage, which really is pretty close. In a big sea, when you're kind of just throwing them in relatively blind, you really would have to blanket the area.
At least the U.S. Navy is very adaptable. They may start off on the wrong foot, but they'll figure it out. So in 1943-44, the Japanese subs were getting massacred for no payback to the Japanese. The Americans had better intel. They had throw-ahead projectiles. They had a lot more aircraft to employ. They had better tactics, and the Japanese were still using these patrol lines and trying to move them around to chase U.S. invasion forces or task forces. But of course, once you move it with your sub on the surface, you're very vulnerable. So they were massacred later in the war for almost no effect for the Japanese. It wasn't hard to defeat them, but you had to employ the right weapons, right tactics.
I'm right in saying the problem they have is that submarines are slow underwater. So if you're trying to move them about and you're trying to move them to catch a target that is on its way, you need to do it with all haste. But if you can't go all haste because you're submerged, you can never get to where you need to be in time to deploy correctly. the nub of the problem.
That's the crux of the issues, all right? So you can't chase them down if you're submerged. It's not going to work, no way. So you've got to surface, right? And of course, then you're much more vulnerable to detection and attack.
There's an unwillingness to want to you show their hand by doing that, which is, I guess, it's reasonable if you're going to be shot out of the water from the air attack rather than the depth charge.
And the Japanese, they knew they were vulnerable, but later on in the war, and even during that Pearl Harbor operation, a couple of weeks after Pearl Harbor, there was another wave of submarines that came out to patrol the area southeast of Oahu, and they did detect an American aircraft carrier. So it was very exciting, right? So the command authorities gave other submarines orders to chase down this carrier task force, and eventually they did get a shot at it, and they damaged it. So that was the first time during the war when they had a truly significant impact on the war, because they put this carrier out of action for a couple of months. But so they got in the habit then of issuing orders to the submarines to constantly change their location based on the latest intelligence they got on the Americans. And that was very hard to do because it made your submarines vulnerable. They're always on the move, right? And it's hard to chase down a surface task force like that. But they did it. And the Americans also had problems at this point in the war because they didn't have radar on their aircraft for the most part, and ships didn't always have radar either. So the Japanese, didn't pay a high price for doing that, for moving their stuff around on the surface like this. But later in the war, 43, 44, when they tried that, and there were American aircraft blanketing the operating area with radar, they paid a high price for that.
I believe the German goals of the U-boats was just to sink tonnage. There's no sort of strategic, only aim for oil tankers or only aim for this. I mean, what was the Japanese strategic aim with its submarine fleet? Is it just to sink anything, or were they quite specific in what they were aiming to target?
Yeah, it was very specific because they were an adjunct to the battle fleet. So they were ordered to sink capital ships. And since there weren't any American battleships running around at that point because they were too slow, and it's a myth that the battle line was destroyed at Pearl Harbor. 3 months after the Pearl Harbor attack, they pulled some ships from the Atlantic Fleet. But so there was a lot of battleships to use, but they chose not to use them because they were too slow to keep up with the carriers. So that left the carrier as the capital ship. So that was the primary target. And there's a chart in the book about all the carriers that they had during 42. There were only a handful, and how much time they were able to operate and how much time they were put out of service for due to sub-attack. And it was a fairly significant percentage of time that the Japanese put carriers out of action for due to sub-attack. So they did have an impact on the American fleet, during 1942, which is when they fought these 4 carrier battles. So 4 carrier battles were fought during the year, and for most of those, 1 or 2 American carriers were out of action because of submarine attack. So they were effective for that very focused mission they had.
Well, it's three of the 6 carriers in 41, 42 were struck, which, as you say, is surprisingly effective considering that you don't necessarily, they don't trip off the tongue of being there at Midway or Coral Sea. It's all about the carriers. Yet actually they had worked there, done what they were meant to do.
Yeah, they're pretty good, all things considered.
Were they? I mean, how present were they at the Coral Sea and Midway?
Yes, they certainly were, and because you don't know much about them, that means that they didn't get much done, right? So they weren't a lot there in Coral Sea. I forget the number from the book, but there was a handful of modern subs doing a scouting mission, but they were deployed in the wrong direction. So I think they were able to sight an American carrier. I think it was Yorktown, in fact, briefly during the battle, but they got no shots in at a target during the battle. And at Midway, and this just shows the shambolic nature of Japanese naval planning. And one more proof of that is is the submarine force. So they were not able to use many of their modern units in the operation. And here is the biggest operation of the war. The war meant to decisively defeat the American Navy, to clean it out. You know, the end of the American Navy is the view of Yamamoto. It's his baby. It's his plan. It's his chance for a decisive battle against the Americans. And yet the submarine force is caught off guard. They don't have their best units ready. And those guys that are ready were late leaving their bases in the man-made islands because of readiness problems. And so they were late arriving on station, and they didn't play a role in the battle. The American carriers had already gone through their patrol area from Pearl Harbor to Midway before they even got on station. So totally ineffective. And the only reason why they were effective is because the Japanese aircraft were able to torpedo an American carrier at Yorktown, and it was off Midway. The Japanese sighted it dead in the water, so they knew exactly where it was. So that's how the Japanese were able to send a submarine out there and sink it. Other than that, they had no role in the battle.
It does strike me as surprising, considering how much gets written about the Japanese surface fleet and how effective they could be, and as you say, they're going after this one big battle. Yeah, they don't seem to have necessarily written into that strategy the submarine effectively as part of that battle group that it's sending forward.
Well, they tried to, using their same old tactics, the scouting line and all that stuff, but they just weren't deployed correctly, and they were deployed too late.
It struck me as those vaguely annoying what-if questions. How much might they have been better deployed picking off US logistical lines into the Pacific, because there'd be presumably easy pickings for the submarines, and they, rather than actually just sort of prowling around waiting for the prize ships.
I would submit that that's also mythology, that the Japanese submarine force would have been better deployed and more effective against American supply lines. And if you can't even find combatants in an area where they're going to be, like, for example, they tried to cut off the supply lines from bases, Hawaii and other spots in the South Pacific to Guadalcanal. And so they knew exactly where the supply lines were running through. And in that effort, they were totally ineffective. They sank, well, actually, they didn't sink anything. They were able to launch mini-subs and sink one cargo ship off Guadalcanal. That was it. Because it's a big ocean, right? If you're trying to hit supply lines from the west coast of the U.S. to Hawaii, or from Hawaii, say, to the Gilberts or other spots in the Central Pacific, it's a huge ocean. And the Japanese did have a fairly small subforce, so it'd be very hard for them with their very conservative tactics and lack of intelligence and lack of air reconnaissance to find a target, much less to hit it and sink it. And then, of course, it'd be even harder to maintain that pressure week after week, month after month, given the long times from base to patrol area and back. So that is mythology that the Japanese, well, what they should have done was hit those sparsely defended, and they were fairly, undefended supply lines. What they did do with some success, they did send some subs out to the Indian Ocean. And they did have some fairly rich pickings out there, because they were able to sit these subs right there on the supply lines along the coast of India or wherever, and they were able to score, for Japanese subs, very high sinkings for a patrol. It wasn't up to German standards, but for Japanese, it was much better than they were able to do out in the other parts of the Pacific. But that didn't work, though, against the Americans in the Pacific, because that was too well defended for the most part.
You mentioned mini subs earlier. Were these the kamikaze type submarines rather than the little submarines that go in and attach limpet mines or anything? Are they? Is that what they are with the Japanese?
No, they were top secret weapons, and they were meant not to be kamikaze. So there was the attempt and the illusion that the crew would be survived. And of course, the Japanese knew that was probably fiction, There was a time off of Guadalcanal when the crews of these mini-subs were rescued. So it wasn't total fiction. There was some chance of survival. So it wasn't meant to be a kamikaze operation. But these crews were very, very highly trained. For many subs of the period, they were advanced, but they're still very primitive. So they're very hard to navigate, very hard to operate. So there were 5 of them there at Pearl Harbor, and they achieved nothing. And then they were deployed off Australia and off Madagascar and off Guadalcanal, and they were largely ineffective. And again, they were aimed at fleet units. It was a way to attack an enemy fleet in port. So again, it was another attempt to use, to employ their strategy of attacking the fleet, be it in or out of port, with subs.
Yeah, that makes sense, because you're not exactly going to be able to torpedo them through the whilst in port, which sort of brings me to something I hadn't realised. The Japanese is it Type 93 Long Lance? It was a superb torpedo, but I just assumed that it would have been on the submarines. Why wasn't it on the submarines?
Because it was too darn big, first of all, and it was oxygen propelled, so it was very volatile to handle that stuff in a sub. So the same weapon would not be used easily handled on a submarine. But still, their submarine-launched torpedoes were very good. They were much better than the Americans, obviously, who had very unreliable torpedoes. It was a very good torpedo. It wasn't Type 93 good, but that thing was a monster, and it couldn't have been on a sub.
I can't remember which some of the strikes that they get off those where they've just sent out the fan of torpedoes, and they are miles and miles away when they hit, and they're just beg a belief how effective that was as a weapon. But
there were problems with the earlier war. In Java Sea, here they had this war-winning weapon used for the first time, and they fired something like 153 of them at different points of the Battle of Java Sea, and a total of 3 hit. A lot of problems with premature detonation. They fixed those problems, but even the Type 93 had problems.
It's just a slight aside. I noticed this. Were they any worse than anybody else's problems? Because, obviously the Americans were a disaster. I don't know what the British and the German torpedoes were like.
Yeah, they weren't as bad as American torpedoes, that's for sure. And the Germans have problems too, but they're magnetic detonators. So up there in Norway, for example, their first year or so of the war in 1940, when they had the invasion of Norway, rich pickings. They had these great shots at British ships, and torpedoes were not working. They did not detonate near their targets. And the British, copied a German G7 type at one point. So that's how they got around a lot of their torpedo problems. But the Japanese torpedoes, be they surface launch, the Type 93, or air launch, the Type 91, or the sub torpedoes, were all very good and very reliable.
So at the end of this sort of period we're looking at, it seems rather ignominious that rather a lot of these submarines get tied up with logistical milk runs, I guess is one way of putting them, resupplying. Why does this happen? Why are they pulled off offensive duties?
Because they had no other option to supply these forces, and the Japanese Navy felt duty-bound to make an attempt to supply these isolated garrisons. So there wasn't a good choice, so they had to take fleet units off duty to do this. And later on, they built transport subs. In fact, even the Japanese Army built their own subs to supply their guys. They couldn't trust the Navy altogether to prioritize that as a mission. But, that came a year or two later. So there was no other choice than to let them totally starve. And that was seen as unpalatable by the Japanese Navy.
But what effect does that then have on the submarines? Presumably they were pummeled doing these sort of milk runs.
That's true. But most of all, it takes them off of fleet duties, and now they're not able to patrol either against civilian targets, supply lines, or against the American fleet. So it had a big impact because it brought down the numbers even more. And it's a misnomer. People think that the Japanese they think they had a big fleet. So why can't they do what the Germans did? The Germans were able to send 40 subs in a wolf pack to attack a convoy. why couldn't the Japanese do that? Because that would have pummeled the convoy. Well, they didn't have 40 submarines operational at any one time in the entire Pacific theater, probably, for most of the war. So the numbers just weren't there to support any kind of campaign to attack American supply lines. It was a pretty small force.
Well, I guess that's why they come in their own round, like a Guadalcanal, because a small force can look quite concentrated when the action's going on and on in the same small part of what.
You can maximize.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
How effective do we think the Japanese submarine fleet was, or did the American US Navy underperform, or in its role? Because it strikes me as for what their mission to get the carriers, they seem to have done quite well in these 41, 42.
Yeah, they did do pretty well, 41, 42. And if you look at there's the focus of the entire operation, and that was the carriers, they did pretty well. But other than that, it's a pretty thin resume there. They were able to pick off a couple of cruisers and a small number of auxiliary ships, and that's it. And meanwhile, even in 42, when the Americans had submarines with torpedoes that didn't work, they were still able to score much better than that. But if you look at what they were tasked to do, is sink American capital ships, and the capital ship would have been the aircraft carrier. On that mission alone, they were successful. But for everything else, they were largely ineffective. Well, not largely, they were ineffective.
And how effective do you think the American defensive measures were against them? In the anti-submarine warfare role against them?
Again, they were totally ineffective. Taking, for example, Midway. So here's a carrier, a Yorktown, which is dead in the water, but still apparently not in sinking condition. So there's hopes that we can salvage this carrier and bring it back to Pearl, not too far away, and repair it and return it to service. And that's huge because there were only a handful of American carriers, right? So it's a big deal to save this carrier. So the Americans leave 6 destroyers around Yorktown to defend her as salvage ops pick up speed. And so Japanese sent one older sub, the I-168, captained by a pretty good skipper, as it turns out. And this guy's able to maneuver around the area of the carrier underwater, taking a couple of checks with his periscope. And he misjudged the first approach, had to go back and do it all over again. But the Americans never were able to detect this submarine before the attack was launched, on their sonars. And then, of course, once the attack was launched, then they were able to see where the torpedoes came from. They were able to figure that out. They launched a very heavy attack. It was too late, and they weren't even able to sink the submarine. So there's an example, of ideal conditions for the American destroyers to detect and attack a submarine before it launched its attack. They were unable to do so. It's
a really interesting period because it is that sort of forgotten period of the war for this, because it's almost like two boxers who are trying to work out how to fight one another, but flailing around at the same time. If that's a poor analogy, really.
And the Japanese, have never been known for their dexterity trying to adapt tactics and strategies. I mean, yes, they're able to do so, but not quickly. And the Americans were able to adapt much more quickly. So after this period of the war, the Japanese had some success later in the war. But in the case of the submarine fleet and how to employ it and tactics to use during its employment, they did not learn very well very quickly. So, and by and large, I'll make this sweeping generalization. By and large, Japanese naval leaders were not able to adapt as quickly as their American counterparts.
Well, I wondered if they just never, whilst they had a really superb I might be wrong here, but it was a good handle on carrier warfare and how that was going to pan out, possibly better than others. It's almost like they overlooked the whole how the submarines might have worked, and they couldn't really get their head round it. Whereas the Americans, who are very good at thinking on their feet, and especially when they get them on the back foot and just can outproduce everybody, it's much easier for them to have the luxury to change tactics and learn.
Yeah, it helps be well resourced, that's for sure. And the Japanese submarines, being that they were very large, they're good sea boats for surface steaming, but not so much for underwater steaming, underwater operations. So, for example, they were slow to dive. Now that didn't matter if you're not in a heavy ASW threat area. But later in the war, these submarines were slow to dive, and that's death when you're being attacked by an aircraft or by a surface ship. So their design, paid off. It wasn't obvious at the start of the war that this was going to be a problem, but later on in the war it was a big problem. As the British found out and the Germans found out, in the war, you need to pull the plug, within 30 seconds to be safe in most cases.
Mark, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you. That was great. If you want to know more about the Japanese submarine campaign in the early part of the war, Mark's book is US Navy Fleet Destroyer versus Imperial Japanese Navy Fleet Submarine. I will put a link on www.podcast.com. If you want to see what else Mark has published on the Pacific, have a look at Osprey's website, ospreypublishing.com. He is prolific on the topic of the Pacific War. Don't forget you can find me on Facebook, WW2Podcast. Give the page a like. I do post World War II things I find interesting, usually in direct reference to the latest episode of the podcast. Well, that's it for me. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.